Explained by the Billy Meier contacts. Carl Gustav Jung, see also Karl Graf, see also Gustav Lehmann, see also Rudolf Emanuel Zimmermann.
Contact Report 200.
That is also known to me. Also that he, Karl Graf, was led to you by Svath's telepathic impulses, and that he spoke about you with his friend, Carl Gustav Jung, whom you later became acquainted with in Zurich, when you visited your handicapped sister Verena in the Matilda Escher home, and you made yet another visit to the psychiatric hospital, Burghölzli, where C.G. Jung was visiting. Explanation teacher Karl Graf, with whom the little Edward Billy visited during the first 3 school years, was not only one of Eddie's great friends, but he also stood on friendly terms with priest Rudolf Emanuel Zimmermann and with the well-known psychologist and psychiatrist, Professor Carl Gustav Jung. Karl Graf had been enlightened by the little Edward in reference to his contacts with the extraterrestrial Svath, and, as proof, even once received the opportunity to be allowed to observe his aircraft, with Svath's permission, in Erachfeld in Bulach, when Edward went to a contact. A contact with Svath was excluded, but the experience was enough for the teacher to promote, from then on, the scholastic progress of the boy entrusted to him, also partly in his spare time on a private basis. At the same time, it could not fail, of course, that Karl Graf was faced with many questions from Edward, which he also answered, faithful to his knowledge and understanding. If he could not do this, however, especially when it came to strictly psychological and life-related matters, then he contacted his friend, Professor Carl Gustav Jung, to whom he had reported of Edward, as well as of his sighting experience regarding Svath's aircraft. The professor saw no reason in Karl Graf's remarks not to accept them as truth, as he also found no reason in them not to take a stand and not to let Edward's questions go unanswered. Interested in the boy, who asked such profound questions, he requested a photo from the teacher in order to be able to make himself a mental picture of Edward. Teacher Graf procured the photo and handed it over to the professor for examination, who made himself an exact mental image of little Edward. He also told his little niece, Luzinstag, of the young Edward, which was the real impetus for the fact that she became interested in extraterrestrials and their aircraft, and that she began to strive in the course of her life for all attainable photographic and written material, and became a world-renowned UFO researcher, who did not let herself be easily deceived. Still as a young lad, Billy got to know Professor Carl Gustav Jung personally. At the same time, the personal acquaintance came about through a happy stroke of fate, whereby the following happened. Together with his mother, Billy, at that time still Edward, visited his sister Verena in the Matilda Escher home in Zurich, who had been severely physically disabled since her birth and who had been staying there. From there he set out on his short trip down to the psychiatric hospital, Burghölzli, where he still wanted to pick up an acquaintance, who visited her sick father there. As Edward was waiting for the acquaintance in front of the main entrance, a man unexpectedly came to him and asked if he was indeed Edward, the former student of Karl Graf. He had seen a picture of him that the teacher had shown to him, and as far as he could tell, not much had changed. He was Professor Jung, the friend of the teacher, the one who had always answered the difficult and unusual questions for him. This resulted in an intensive conversation between the two, which lasted for 46 minutes, and it was finished when the acquaintance, for whom Edward had waited, stepped out of the main entrance. After the dismissal, Professor Jung and Edward went their ways and never met again.
Contact Report 662.
1945. You have been working on this for years, just as I teach you which means that your manner of speaking and pronunciation, both spoken and written, is already above average today, which is why your teacher, Karl Graf, together with the doctor and psychiatrist Carl Gustav Jung, often talks about your questions when they meet in Küsnacht or in Zurich, and explicitly only because of you. Eduard. Yes, I know. On one occasion, I recently met Mr. Jung at the Burgholzli Psychiatric Clinic in Zurich when he was visiting or picking up someone there. I met him not far from the Burgholzli when I was visiting my severely handicapped sister Verena in the Matilda Escher Heim, together with my mother, as you know.
Contact Report 719.
I also worked out Svath's predictions at that time and wrote them as appeals, which were then corrected by my two teachers, Karl Graf and Gustav Lehmann, and together with Pastor Zimmermann, were also translated into English and French and typed up. With the help of my teacher, Gustav Lehmann, I was then able to reproduce everything with the school's reprinting machine and send it worldwide to hundreds of media, namely newspapers, magazines, radio stations, and important organizations all over the world, for which both teachers and Pastor Zimmermann provided me with the necessary addresses, to which Professor Jung also contributed some. That everyone was fully on my side was arranged by your father Svath with Pastor Zimmermann, who in turn agreed with my first teacher, Karl Graf, and then also with Gustav Lehmann, to help me. However, I was only told that my teacher Karl Graf was also in contact with Professor C.G. Jung and that he approved of all the activities and also contributed financially to everything when I had finished the 6th grade and had to go to teacher fair in the 7th grade. Pastor Zimmermann and my teachers Gustav Lehmann and Karl Graf supported me in every way, but I was not allowed to talk about it because silence had to be maintained. If the whole thing had become public knowledge at that time, there would have been a huge row in Bülach among the municipal authorities, the school authorities, and the church authorities, and certainly also among the population, and all three would have been frowned upon and ostracized and removed from office. What would have happened to Professor Jung, moreover, would probably have been that he would have been labeled a madman. Everyone's help was extremely important, also with regard to the purchase of the envelopes and the postage, which all three of them and also Professor Jung paid for, because I myself had no money and could not have paid for the whole thing. Today, however, I think I'm allowed to talk about it and openly say how and what everything was back then, because all those involved have long since passed away, as have their wives and direct descendants.
This, while you already in the 1940s and 1950s, with the help of your comrades in arms, your two teachers, Pastor Zimmermann and Professor Jung, drew the attention of hundreds of media, radio stations, newspapers, magazines, authorities, governments, and organizations worldwide with your predictions to what is now happening worldwide and fulfilling your predictions.
Contact Report 725.
The records show that Father Zimmermann, on the one hand, concealed his contact with my father, Svath, you and Professor Jung, from his entire family, as was also the case with your two teachers, Graf and Lehmann. Without your knowledge and without the knowledge of his family, Pastor Zimmermann arranged a collaboration with Professor Jung, both of whom, together and with the help of teacher Graf, translated your prediction into English in 1949. My father investigated and worked out the presidencies of the USA, namely their 10 by means of advance visits of the period from 1950 to 2000, for which purpose your prediction, completed by the three of them, that is to say Pastor Zimmermann, Professor Jung, and teacher Graf, into the English language, was closed and sealed in 10 individual document packets. Then I want to interrupt you, excuse me, and go back to the previous topic, namely the predictions that were made available to the presidents of the USA by my father. These presidents were not the only ones, because your predictions were sent worldwide to all government offices of all states on Earth at that time. And in this respect, Professor Jung also acted of his own accord, for he was acquainted at that time with 6 federal councilors of Switzerland, and to them he also sent everything, and according to my father's records, these were the following names: Karl Kobelt, Rodolphe Rubatel, Max Petitpierre, Ernst Nobs, Enrico Celio, and Eduard von Steiger.
Contact Report 727.
I also understand the incident at the barn in the Erachfeld, when my father's Svath's flying apparatus was allowed to be seen and touched by the teacher Graf, which corresponded to a purpose and whereby your teacher received a mental inspiration from my father. This was directed towards teacher Graf confiding in his school colleague teacher Lehman according to his experience, and the urging whispered into him by my father, and also explaining to him that you would repeat the 4th grade with him because teacher Frey would bully you, beat you, and put you back another year in the school grade. And as my father explained, he came to this solution because he realized through observation and looking into the future that teacher Lehman was secretly preoccupied with astronomical findings and was thinking that human life could exist on Mars just as it did on Earth. He was very preoccupied with it because he had heard about a very realistically staged science fiction radio play in America called The War of the Worlds, which had been invented by an Orson Welles. This radio play, broadcast over the airwaves in America, aroused fear and panic among the population of the city of New York, and also far and wide about an invasion from Mars. Teacher Lehman, however, did not believe that the Martian inhabitants could be malicious beings, just as he also did not take the radio play seriously, but he thought about the possibility, as I have already said, that human beings could actually live on Mars as they do on Earth. The 2 teachers, Graf and Lehman, then got together for a joint consultation and followed secret instructions that my father transmitted to them by inspiration, whereby teacher Graf encouraged you in the 3 school years that you spent with him from the 1st to the 3rd grade. And since he was also a friend of Professor Jung, he also made an effort to put many of your questions concerning psychology to him, which he himself could not answer. He also let him in on everything that was going on, so this man was also very well informed about you, but he held back and did not talk about it openly, but only with teacher Graf. But when it happened, because you had gone from the Matilda Escher home, where your mother was with your severely physically handicapped sister Verena, that you had gone down to the Burghölzli Clinic in Zurich, because my father Svath ordered you to do so, as he also did with Professor Carl Gustav Jung, that your acquaintance came about. Then the development began. That on the one hand, your 2 teachers, Graf and Lehman, as well as also Pastor Zimmermann, were contacted in person by my father Svath, informed and variously enlightened and instructed. It also came about through Professor Jung that after his passing in 1961, towards the end of the 1970s, his niece Lou Zinstag came to you, who dealt with the so-called UFO phenomenon that had arisen worldwide, which a man in America named Kenneth Arnold had raised as a result of observing flying objects unknown to him. Your acquaintance, which my father Svath arranged, was only a small part of what he did, for he also did a lot with your 2 teachers, Karl Graf and Gustav Lehmann, which he also concealed from you. He ordered both of them to the barn in the Erachfeld, and ordered them together into his flying apparatus, which you call the Pear spaceship, in order to fly with them around the Earth and also around the Earth's moon during a flight lasting several hours, and to inform them about your mission. He further instructed both of them regarding the reality of creation as well as the falsity of religions, as he also informed them, as was the case with Pastor Zimmerman, that you would suffer terrible slander and be harassed by the school authorities, etc., throughout your school years and also for some time afterwards as a result of slander. My father also taught them how the falsity of religions and the faith of earth humans came about. Through all the teachings, both teachers caused themselves, as was also the case with Reverend Zimmerman, to turn to the truth from then on and to be helpful to you in a secret way. However, they had to commit themselves to conceal their experience, their received teachings and information, as well as their task from the outside, and also that external forces such as would not be able to perceive anything that, so it was incumbent upon all of them, the two teachers, as well as Pastor Zimmerman, to remain silent, because on the one hand, they would have forfeited their reputation and their livelihood by making an announcement, and on the other hand, they would not have been able to provide the necessary help for you, but furthermore also with regard to... This is a brief account of the events that occurred in connection with Pastor Zimmerman, Professor Jung, and your two teachers, Karl Graf and Gustav Lehmann.
Contact Report 733.
But I may now speak about what I had already mentioned on the 30th of November, which my father had already announced to you in 1945, that the niece or Lozinstag of Professor Carl Gustav Jung, whom you met in July 1945, would come to see you in the 1980s and then immediately tell Wendell Stevens about you, and he would come to see you immediately.
Contact Report 749.
Consequently, they are also unable to grasp the true origin and reason, precisely why the climate is changing dangerously, and will henceforth bring immense destruction, extermination, and death, as I predicted from the 1940s and 1950s onwards. At that time, I was able to send everything in German and English to all well-known public media, such as radio stations, newspaper and journal editors, as well as to all governments. Thanks to the energetic translation and financial help of Pastor Zimmerman, Professor C.G. Jung, and my teachers Karl Graf and Gustav Lehmann, but I never received any response, nor was anything ever published. Later, however, then in the 1950s, an editor or journalist of the Limmattaler Tagblatt took one of my predictions, rewrote it, and published it under a different name. Note, see Contact Report 475.
Contact Report 754.
Then I want to say something again about the corona plague, about which I already wrote predictions in the 1940s and 1950s and sent them to newspapers, governments, and various organizations worldwide, with the tremendous support of Pastor Zimmerman, Professor Carl Gustav Jung, and my two teachers Graf and Lehmann.
Contact Report 757.
You wrote this corona epidemic as a prediction to the leaders of Switzerland as a 10-year-old boy in the 1940s, because even then you were well educated in written language because my father and your teachers taught you exceptionally well. Even though they assisted you in formulating and writing your predictions and put your work into the correct version, you are still to be named as the author. Your letter was written in several languages. With the help of your two teachers, Graf and Lehmann, Pastor Zimmerman and Professor Jung, consequently everything was sent in this way worldwide to governments, journals, newspapers, various organizations, and radio stations, as I was able to see from my father's Svath's annals, and search out the whole thing because you asked me about it.
Contact Report 759.
Because Teacher Graf often talked to you about your mission, and you often brought questions of a psychological nature to him, which he could not answer, he sought the acquaintance of the pastor's son, Professor Carl Gustav Jung, which Pastor Zimmerman arranged for him by also contacting him and initiating him into the whole of your mission. He also committed himself to lifelong silence and stood by Teacher Graf regarding your questions, which they discussed together, after which Teacher Graff could then answer them for you after days or weeks.
Contact Report 783.
The ignorant, even if they call themselves scholars and scientists, with their big and all-knowing mouths, always know more than those who really know and who know from experience. Unfortunately, there is no cure for know-it-allism on Earth, and besides, those who are officially studied and know everything better are always right than the unstudied, who are not the scholars. I have known that since I was a boy, and I still remember how Father Zimmermann, Teachers Graff, Lehmann, and Professor Jung explained it to me when the five of us sat together and discussed the arrogance of the scientists and other scholars. All four of them said that I should not be bothered by it, but should just accept everything as it is, because arrogant people all over the world are just those who want to know everything better and would never let go of their opinion because they had learned it that way. It is as bad as a religious belief, because once people have become addicted to such a belief, it is very difficult for them to get rid of it, because what has once become fixed in the human beings can break through again even after many decades.